What if the course of history could have been changed by a single mistake, a single moment when the Third Reich, at the height of its power, faced the consequences of its own blunders? Hitler's greatest errors didn't just cost him battles, they began the slow unraveling of the Nazi Empire. This is the story of those fateful moments when the cracks in the Third Reich began to show. It was the winter of 1942, a year that would forever change the face of the Second World War. The Germans, having swept across Europe with seemingly unstoppable force, were now locked in a brutal battle on the Eastern Front with the Soviet Union. From the streets of Paris to the shores of the Atlantic, from the deserts of North Africa to the frozen steppes of Russia, the Wehrmacht had conquered more territory than any army since Napoleon. But as the Wehrmacht pressed eastward, deeper into the vast Soviet heartland, little did they know that the seeds of their defeat were being sown in the frozen fields of Russia. The very hubris that had carried them to the gates of Moscow would soon become their undoing. In the bitter cold near the city of Stalingrad, Hitler made a decision that would haunt him and his army. A decision driven by arrogance and personal pride that ignored the advice of his most experienced generals and would lead to the greatest disaster in German military history. As the Axis forces tightened their grip on the Soviet city, they didn't anticipate the Russian resolve or the fierce winter waiting just around the corner. By the time they realized their mistake, it was already too late. To understand the catastrophe at Stalingrad, we must first understand how the Germans arrived at this fateful crossroads. The Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, had proven to be a far more formidable adversary than Hitler had anticipated. After the initial success of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the Germans seemed poised to crush the Red Army within months. Hitler himself had boasted that the Soviet Union would collapse like a house of cards before the might of the Wehrmacht. 3 million German and Axis troops had surged across the Soviet border on a front stretching nearly 2,000 miles. Initially, the invasion seemed to justify Hitler's confidence. The Red Army, still reeling from Stalin's purges of the officer corps in the late 1930s, suffered catastrophic losses. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners were taken. Cities fell like dominoes. But by late 1942, the Wehrmacht was facing fierce resistance as they pushed deeper into Soviet territory. The quick victory Hitler had promised had not materialized. The Soviet winter of 1941 had already delivered a brutal lesson at the gates of Moscow, where German forces, ill-equipped for the savage cold, had been pushed back for the first time. Yet Hitler had learned nothing from that setback. For the summer campaign of 1942, he devised an ambitious plan, Case Blue. The objective was to drive southeast, capture the oil fields of the Caucasus, and simultaneously take Stalingrad, a vital industrial city on the Volga River that bore the Soviet dictator's name. The city of Stalingrad was more than just a strategic target, it was symbolic. For Hitler, capturing a city named after his adversary would be a propaganda victory of immense proportions. For Stalin, losing the city that bore his name would be an unthinkable humiliation. This clash of egos would transform Stalingrad into something far beyond a mere military objective. It would become a death trap. In August 1942, Hitler ordered his forces to take Stalingrad at all costs, hoping to cripple Soviet war production and secure the vital oil supplies from the Caucasus that would fuel his war machine. The Sixth Army, under General Paulus, was tasked with capturing the city. Paulus was an intelligent, methodical officer, a staff planner more than a battlefield commander. He would need every ounce of that intelligence in the months ahead. The German forces, numbering over 200,000 men of the Sixth Army, supported by elements of the Fourth Panzer Army, were ill-prepared for the brutal conditions they would face. They had no idea that they would be drawn into a vicious house-to-house fight that would stretch their resources to the limit and break the spirit of even the most hardened veterans. On August 23, 1942, the Luftwaffe launched a massive aerial bombardment of Stalingrad. Over 1,000 aircraft turned the sky black as they dropped their deadly payloads on the city below. Firestorms erupted, consuming entire neighborhoods. Thousands of civilians perished in a single day. The Volga River itself seemed to burn as oil storage tanks exploded, sending rivers of flame across the water. Meanwhile, the Soviets, under General Vasily Chuikov, were determined to defend Stalingrad at all costs. Chuikov was a different breed of commander, tough, brutal, and willing to sacrifice everything for victory. The strategic value of the city was immense, and Stalin had issued his famous Order No. 227, not one step back. Officers who retreated without orders would be shot. Soldiers who fled would be gunned down by blocking detachments positioned behind their own lines. The Soviet 62nd Army, though vastly outnumbered and outgunned, dug in among the ruins, knowing that the survival of the Soviet Union might depend on the outcome. Chuikov devised a desperate strategy: hug the enemy close. By keeping Soviet positions within meters of enemy lines, he made it impossible for the Luftwaffe to bomb effectively without hitting their own troops. By 1400 hours on September 13, 1942, the Germans had breached the outer defenses of Stalingrad and reached the city center. Yet, despite initial successes, the fighting turned into a brutal street-by-street, building-by-building, room-by-room battle unlike anything the Germans had experienced before. The German soldiers, wearied from months of fighting across the steppes, found themselves stuck in the rubble of the city, surrounded by a well-coordinated Soviet defense that turned every pile of bricks into a fortress and every sewer pipe into a firing position. This was a new kind of warfare, what the Soviets grimly called the Rottenkrieg, the Rat War. Snipers picked off soldiers from the skeletal remains of apartment buildings. Grenades were thrown through windows and down stairwells. Men fought with knives and sharpened spades in pitch-black basements. The average life expectancy of a Soviet soldier in Stalingrad was measured in days, sometimes hours, yet they kept fighting. The German Luftwaffe bombarded the city relentlessly, turning it into a smoldering ruin of twisted steel and shattered concrete. But the destruction worked against the Germans. Despite the devastation, the Soviets would not yield. The rubble created countless defensive positions. The Red Army fought from every building, every courtyard, every basement, and every crater, making the city a tomb for the advancing Germans. Iconic locations became legendary battlegrounds. The grain elevator, a massive concrete structure where a small group of Soviet defenders held out for days against repeated German assaults. Pavlov's house, a fortified apartment building that Soviet Sergeant Pavlov and his men defended for 58 days, repelling constant attacks and becoming a symbol of resistance. The Barricade factory, the Red October factory, the tractor factory, industrial complexes where men fought among the machinery, where workers and soldiers fought side by side. By October, the fighting had become so fierce that it seemed impossible for either side to gain a clear advantage. The Germans measured their advances in meters, not kilometers. A Soviet general darkly joked that they had recaptured the kitchen of a house, but the Germans still held the bedroom. By now, the Germans were spread dangerously thin. They had underestimated the resilience of the Soviet defense and the vastness of the Russian winter awaiting them. Hitler had split his forces, sending Army Group A towards the Caucasus oil fields, while the 6th Army and 4th Panzer Army attacked Stalingrad. The flanks of the German position at Stalingrad were held not by German troops, but by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian armies, less well-equipped, less well-trained, and with
with little enthusiasm for Hitler's war. By mid-November, temperatures had dropped to a staggering -40 degrees Celsius. Soldiers' eyelids froze shut, weapons jammed, vehicles wouldn't start. The supply lines to Stalingrad were stretched to the breaking point, with supplies having to travel hundreds of miles through hostile territory. As the Soviet counteroffensive Operation Uranus began on November 19, 1942, the Germans realized they were facing a massive two-pronged attack from the north and south, and their situation was growing increasingly desperate. The Soviet plan was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. General Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet Union's most capable commander, had quietly assembled over 1 million men, 13,500 heavy guns, 900 tanks, and 1,100 aircraft. While the Germans exhausted themselves in the ruins of Stalingrad, the Soviets prepared to strike at the weak points, the Romanian armies on the flanks. At 0730 a.m. on November 19th, the earth itself seemed to explode. Soviet artillery opened up with a barrage so intense that Romanian soldiers went mad from the sheer terror of it. Then came the tanks, the legendary T-34s, crashing through Romanian positions that collapsed like paper. Within hours, entire divisions had been destroyed or were fleeing in panic. The northern pincer
The Snipers' War. Within the larger battle, smaller, more personal wars were being fought. The Battle of the Snipers became legendary, a deadly game of patience and precision played out across the ruins. Soviet sniper Vasily Zaitsev became a hero of the Soviet Union, credited with killing over 200 German soldiers during the battle. He operated from carefully camouflaged positions in the rubble, sometimes remaining motionless for hours, waiting for a target. In Stalingrad, I learned that patience is the sniper's greatest weapon, he said. You might wait all day for one shot, but that one shot could save 100 of your comrades. The Soviet command understood the propaganda value of their snipers. Zaitsev's exploits were publicized throughout the Red Army and even reported in the Soviet press. His most famous duel against an elite German sniper school director named Major Erwin Koenig may have been embellished or even fabricated for propaganda purposes, but the psychological impact was real. German soldiers lived in constant fear of the Soviet snipers. A moment of carelessness, exposing yourself for just a second, could mean instant death. Officers were particularly targeted. Soviet snipers learned to identify German officers by their binoculars, their maps, their uniforms, and their gestures. Killing an officer could throw an entire unit into confusion. The Germans developed their own sniper units in response. Gefreiter Josef Allerberger, one of Germany's most successful snipers, operated at Stalingrad and later on the Eastern Front, accumulating over 250 confirmed kills. He described it as hunting the most dangerous game, men who were hunting you. Women also fought as snipers. Ludmila Pavlichenko, though not present at Stalingrad, had already become famous with over 300 confirmed kills. At Stalingrad itself, women like Tanya Chernova took up sniper rifles, defying gender norms and proving equally deadly as their male counterparts. The sniper war was psychological warfare at its most intimate. Every soldier knew that death could come at any moment, from any angle, without warning. The stress of living under constant sniper threat drove men to break down, to make fatal mistakes, or simply to give up.